Ethan arrived at the small chapel just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. The air was thick with a bitter chill that seemed to seep into his bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Today was supposed to be a day of mourning, a final goodbye to the man who raised him. But something in the atmosphere felt off, like a tension wound tightly beneath polite faces and somber whispers. The crowd inside was small, but clustered tightly, like a fragile puzzle holding itself together by sheer will. Ethan recognized most of them, family friends, distant cousins, neighbors from the old neighborhood. But there were a few faces he didn't recognize, their eyes flickering briefly toward him before looking away. There was an unease in the way they exchanged glances, a quiet undercurrent of something unsaid. His mother, Linda, stood near the front, her face pale and tight with grief. She tried to offer Ethan a smile as he approached, but it faltered. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but also a flicker of fear, almost as if she was waiting for something to happen. Ethan's heart tightened, but he brushed it aside, telling himself it was just the weight of the day. The service began with soft hymns that echoed through the chapel's high ceilings. Ethan sat quietly, watching as the priest spoke of love, forgiveness, and the hope of peace beyond pain. But his mind drifted. He thought about the man in the casket, his father, a man of contradictions, distant at times but fiercely protective. The memories came unbidden. Fishing trips that never happened, birthdays forgotten, the silence that filled rooms when the truth was too heavy to speak. After the ceremony, the mourners gathered in the adjacent hall for the wake. The room buzzed with hushed conversations, the clink of coffee cups and the occasional sob. Ethan moved through the crowd, nodding politely, exchanging condolences. But the feeling of disquiet persisted, growing heavier with every passing minute. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a woman standing alone by the far wall. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held a strange intensity. She wore a simple black dress, but there was something about her, an unfamiliarity that drew Ethan's attention. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave a small, hesitant nod before looking away. Ethan felt a jolt of recognition, though he couldn't place why. He tried to approach her, but before he could, a sudden commotion near the door caught everyone's attention. Voices rose briefly, then fell back into an uneasy silence. Ethan glanced back at the woman, but she had slipped away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Conversations that started hopeful dissolved into whispered rumors. Ethan caught fragments. Mentions of old letters, a secret kept too long, a family he didn't know he had. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself outside, alone, staring at the dark sky. The weight of loss was there, but beneath it, something else. The stirring of questions that refused to be quieted. What wasn't being said? What secrets had his father taken to the grave? Ethan didn't know yet, but he felt certain of one thing. This funeral was only the beginning. The next morning, Ethan woke with a dull ache behind his eyes, the weight of last night's unease pressing down on him. The funeral had ended, but the questions it raised were just beginning to unravel. He tried to push the thoughts aside as he got ready for the day, but the image of the woman at the wake lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. At the small cafe across from the chapel, Ethan sat nursing a black coffee, staring out the window at the autumn leaves swirling in the wind. He was replaying the events of the night before when the door chimed softly behind him. He didn't look up immediately. "Ethan?" The voice was soft but clear. He turned slowly to see the woman from the wake standing there, hesitant but determined. She looked even more out of place in the bright morning light. her dark eyes searching his face. "Yes," he said cautiously. "I'm Rachel," she said, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Rachel Hayes." Ethan's heart skipped. The name was unfamiliar, but the urgency in her voice was unmistakable. "I know this is strange, and I'm sorry to just show up like this, but I need to talk to you about your father." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What about him?" Rachel took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm your half-sister." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He blinked, searching her face for any sign of deception, confusion, or cruelty, but all he found was raw sincerity. "Half-sister?" he repeated, voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded. "I know it's a lot to take in. I just found out myself a few weeks ago. I came here today because I thought maybe you should know." Ethan leaned back, trying to steady his racing thoughts. Memories of his childhood flashed, his mother's tight smiles, his father's distant silences, the feeling that something was always just out of reach. "How?" he finally asked. "How could this be true? Why didn't I know?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Because it was kept a secret. My mother and your father, they had a brief relationship years ago. She never told me about you until recently. I found some letters, some old photos." Ethan swallowed hard. Part of him wanted to reject it outright, to dismiss this as a cruel joke, a stranger's delusion. But something deeper stirred inside him, a cracked piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was missing. "Why come now?" Ethan asked. "Why at the funeral?" Rachel looked down, voice barely audible. "Because when I heard about your father passing, I felt like I had to be here, to meet you, to find out if you wanted to know the truth." The cafe felt suddenly too small. Ethan stared out the window again, the world outside moving on, unaware of the quiet earthquake shaking his life. He didn't know if he was ready for this, but deep down, a part of him whispered that some truths, no matter how painful, demanded to be faced. The weight of Rachel's words pressed heavily on Ethan as he left the cafe, the autumn air cool against his skin, but unable to cool the storm raging inside him. Back in the quiet of his apartment, the walls seemed to close in, filled with shadows that whispered questions he wasn't ready to answer. The next day, Rachel called with a tentative voice, asking if they could meet again. Reluctantly, Ethan agreed. He needed to understand, even if the truth threatened to shatter everything he thought he knew. They met in a small park near the city center, where children's laughter floated in the crisp air, oblivious to the secrets being unearthed nearby. Rachel arrived holding a manila envelope, worn at the edges, as if it had traveled through time and silence. "I brought something," she said, handing it to Ethan. "Proof, so this isn't just some crazy story." Ethan opened the envelope carefully, unfolding yellowed letters, faded photographs, and a creased birth certificate bearing a name he didn't recognize. Hers. The letters were addressed to Ethan's father, signed in a delicate script from a woman named Margaret. They spoke of love, regret, and a promise kept silent for decades. One letter mentioned a pregnancy, the fear of discovery, and the hope that one day the truth might find its way. Ethan's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The photos showed a younger version of his father, smiling beside a woman with the same dark hair and eyes as Rachel. The resemblance was undeniable. "Why didn't Mom ever tell me?" Ethan whispered, voice breaking. Rachel shook her head. "I don't know. I asked my mom, but she just said it was complicated, that she never wanted to hurt you."
Ethan folded the paper slowly, the reality sinking in deeper with each breath. He thought about his mother, about the years of whispered silences and guarded secrets, about his father and the two lives he had lived without ever bridging the gap. Ethan's world was no longer just black and white. It was fractured, messy, and painfully real.
The house felt colder than Ethan remembered as he stood in the doorway, clutching the worn envelope close to his chest. The familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet did little to comfort him. His mother, Linda, sat in the living room, her hands trembling around a cup of tea, eyes fixed on the window as if trying to will away the ghosts of the past. For a long moment, neither spoke. Ethan cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. "Mom, I need to talk to you." She looked up slowly, her face a mix of exhaustion and resignation. "I figured this day would come." He hesitated, the words caught in his throat. Finally, he placed the envelope on the coffee table. "Who is she?" "Rachel, my sister." Linda's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "She is your half-sister, Ethan. I never wanted you to find out like this." Ethan sank into the couch, his gaze fixed on the envelope. "Why didn't you tell me? Why keep it a secret all these years?" Linda's voice cracked as she spoke. "It was complicated. Your father and Margaret, they had a relationship before I met him. When she got pregnant, he promised he would take care of it, but they agreed to keep it quiet, for the sake of the family, for you." He swallowed hard, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You lied to me. You lied to me every day of my life." "I didn't lie to hurt you," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, protecting all of us." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "Protecting me by hiding half my family? By pretending my father was someone he wasn't?" Tears slipped down Linda's cheeks. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but every time I tried, the past came crashing down. I was scared, Ethan, scared of losing you, scared of breaking the family apart." He looked at her, seeing the pain etched in her face, but it did little to soften his own hurt. "You don't get to decide what I'm ready for. I'm not a child anymore." Linda nodded, voice barely audible. "I know." The room was thick with unspoken words, the weight of decades pressing down on them both. Ethan's heart ached, not just from the betrayal, but from the shattering of the family he had believed in. After a long pause, he stood, his resolve hardening. "I need time, and I need answers, from you and from him." Linda reached out, but Ethan stepped back. "Don't." He turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind him.
The days following the confrontation were heavy with silence and fractured conversations. Ethan's world felt like it was unraveling at the seams, each thread pulling him further from the life he thought he knew. Linda retreated into herself, her eyes shadowed with guilt and sorrow. She moved through the house like a ghost, her apologies whispered, but never quite reaching Ethan's ears. Their conversations became guarded, brittle exchanges that left both of them feeling more alone than before. Ethan struggled to focus on anything else. Work became a background noise he barely registered. Friends noticed his absence, his distracted demeanor. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to explain. How could he explain a family shattered by secrets, a father he never truly knew, a sister he was just beginning to meet? Rachel reached out carefully, sending texts and leaving voicemails that balanced on the edge of patience and empathy. She shared stories of her own confusion and pain, hoping to build a fragile bridge. But Ethan wasn't ready. Trust was a fragile thing, especially when it had been broken by years of silence. One evening, Ethan found himself standing outside Rachel's apartment, phone in hand, wrestling with the decision to call or turn away. He thought about the photos, the letters, the woman who claimed to be his sister, a stranger who felt like a missing piece of himself. Inside the apartment, Rachel waited, the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. She had hoped this meeting would bring clarity, but feared it might only deepen the wounds. When Ethan finally knocked, the door opened slowly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, words failed them both. "I don't know where to start," Ethan admitted quietly. Rachel smiled, a small flicker of hope breaking through. "Start anywhere. I'm listening." The conversation unfolded in hesitant fragments, stories of childhoods lived apart, memories of fathers who were absent in different ways, and the shared ache of secrets kept too long. Back at home, Linda watched from the window as Ethan and Rachel talked late into the night. A mix of relief and fear churned inside her. The family she had fought to keep together was now slipping through her fingers. The fallout wasn't just about betrayal, it was about rebuilding from the ruins. Trust had to be earned, wounds needed time to heal, and the future remained uncertain. But amidst the pain, there was a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward.
The quiet in Ethan's apartment was heavier than ever. It wasn't the kind of silence that offered peace or rest, but one that pressed down like a suffocating weight, an absence filled with echoes of questions unanswered and truths only partially revealed. The days after the tentative reunion with Rachel had stretched into weeks. Slowly, fragments of conversation, shared memories, and cautious laughter began to weave a fragile connection between the siblings. But even with this new bond, Ethan felt untethered, caught between the past he'd known and the future he had yet to shape. He found himself sitting in his father's study one late evening, the room filled with dusty books, fading photographs, and the scent of worn leather and old paper. It was a space he had avoided for years, associating it with silence, secrets, and the distant figure of a man who had been both protector and enigma. On the desk lay a small wooden box that belonged to his father. Ethan's fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing a collection of letters, some unsigned, others addressed to various names, including Margaret and Linda. He pulled out one letter carefully, its ink faded, but the words clear. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I lived a life of contradictions, torn between duty and desire. I failed in many ways, but never in love for those I called family. If only I could rewrite the past." Ethan closed the letter, a lump forming in his throat. His father was no longer the distant figure he had resented, but a flawed man carrying his own burdens and regrets. Yet that knowledge didn't erase the hurt or the betrayal. The next morning, Ethan met Rachel at a small cafe. They sat across from each other, sharing quiet smiles that spoke volumes of their shared pain and hope. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive him," Ethan admitted, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Rachel nodded. "Neither can I. But maybe forgiveness isn't for him. Maybe it's for us, to free ourselves from the past." Ethan looked out the window, watching leaves fall and swirl in the crisp autumn air. He felt the weight of his father's secrets lifting slightly, replaced by the possibility of new beginnings. Returning home that evening, Ethan faced his mother. The years of silence, the concealed truths, they had all led to this moment of reckoning. "Mom," he began, voice steady, "I'm trying to understand, not just him, but all of it, us." Linda's eyes brimmed with tears, but she managed a small, hopeful smile. "That's all I've ever wanted."
Ethan took a deep breath. I don't know where this road will take us, but I want to try. With you, with Rachel, with whatever family we can build. It wasn't a promise of easy answers or a perfect ending. It was a commitment to face the truth, to accept the pain and the love intertwined, and to move forward despite the fractures. As the sun set beyond the city skyline, Ethan felt a fragile peace settle within him. A peace born not from forgetting the past, but from embracing it fully, scars and all.
Ethan's journey is a portrait of fractured families, hidden truths, and the quiet strength it takes to confront the past. In the shadow of loss, he found not just betrayal, but the chance to redefine what family means. Not by blood alone, but by choice, pain, and forgiveness. This story reminds us that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing. And when they do, we're faced with a choice: to fracture further or to rebuild with what remains. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is the courage to accept imperfection in others and in ourselves, and to find peace beyond the silence.